Alrighty folks, we're back to the same EQ again. Surprise, surprise. So, sticking with that same trend, we're looking at westward expansion still, and how it caused those sectional differences between North and South. As before, if you don't know what sectionalism is, the definition for that is in the previous videos, and also it's been discussed in class up until this point. We should have done a why, what, and impact of sectionalism, so if you're still not certain what that is, make sure to come and talk to me so that we know what the different terms and concepts we've been discussing in class are, and that you are missing some of those and need some assistance. Anyway, so here's the vocab terms we've covered already up until this point in the previous video. Sectionalism, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, Nat Turner's Rebellion, the Wilmot Proviso, the Free Soil Party, Popular Sovereignty, Fugitive Slave Act/law. If those are unfamiliar, just take a peek at those videos again, or just look over your notes, or look at the definitions that we have done together in class. But anyway, to the new vocab, the new words that you'll learn. So, short, sweet, simple, straight to the point. The Underground Railroad, which you should be familiar with up until this point. I believe you learned about that in middle school. Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, and Bleeding Kansas. So anyway, let's get into it. So from 1820 to 1850, sectionalism, as I've discussed already, was mild. There wasn't this huge separation between North and South. It was there. It was apparent. People knew it was there. But it wasn't anything that was going to result in violence, any sort of hatred between South and North. But as we pass 1850, you start to see some changes within the United States. You start to see, first off, the abolitionist movement, which we discussed with all the reforms. It's going to gain a lot of ground in the 1850s, and you're going to see a massive quantity of people start to join into the abolitionist movement because they feel that slavery is no longer a sectional problem. They feel it's a moral issue, a flaw in the human character to enslave each other. They feel it to be an absolute, horrible, moral wrong, and they actually use religion and philosophy and other ideals to support that, to support the fact that slavery is a terrible thing. But the problem is, the entire Southern economy depends upon it. So Southerners see abolitionism as a threat to their existence, a threat to their way of life. Without slaves, there would be no South. There would be no Southern economy. And really, the South can't imagine existing without slavery. That's something that they just could not wrap their heads around. What is the South to do if there are no slaves? So, abolitionists and many Northerners despise the Compromise of 1850, specifically because of the Fugitive Slave Act that was passed. This act, of course, forces northern states and forces northern individuals to send runaway slaves back to the South. And a lot of the times this actually ended up negatively impacting free blacks that lived in the North as well. People who had carried their entire lives out in the North, completely free, never having anything to do with slavery whatsoever, were captured and sent into the South as new slaves. If you've ever seen 12 Years a Slave, the story of Solomon Northrop, that actually is a true instance of that. A free black man within the North that is captured and sent into slavery in the South. And the reasoning behind it is, well, how are we supposed to know these black men are free? What are they going to do? Tell us that they're not a slave? Well, that's exactly something that a slave would say, to try and justify and try and work their way into freedom. So this happens more often than it should have at this point in time. So that is a problem that a lot of abolitionists have as well. It's not only impacting runaway slaves, it's impacting free blacks as well. So you have a lot of Northerners that are going to form vigilante committees to protect these runaways. More people are going to assist in the Underground Railroad and the runaway of slaves from the South, and abolitionism is just going to skyrocket. And people that follow along with the ideology of abolitionists is really going to increase within the North. So some significant abolitionists we discussed already with the Reform movement, but just first off, William Lloyd Garrison, who forms the American Anti-Slavery Society and publishes The Liberator, which is a anti-slavery newspaper, spreading the news, spreading information about the South, about slavery, about anti-slavery movements throughout the North. It's a very, very impactful newspaper to help get the abolitionist news ideology and news out there, to spread those ideas as far and as quickly as possible. You also have ex-slave Frederick Douglass, who publishes the North Star, an abolitionist newspaper as well. And Frederick Douglass is incredibly significant because he is an ex-slave, and because he is so well-spoken and such a well-educated individual. A lot of people actually disputed the fact as to whether or not Frederick Douglass was a slave, which he in fact was prior to his escape and running to the north. But Frederick Douglass, a very significant figure as well, kind of disproving this belief that black men and black women could not be as intelligent and could not be as well educated as white men and white women within the United States. He completely throws that idea out the window, proving that yes, African Americans, black men, could in fact be well educated and could in fact be well spoken. And a lot of people were very amazed at this. He was almost like a carnival attraction because he was so unique and so different from what the status quo had said black men are like. And lastly, the Grimke sisters. With these reform movements, you have a large female presence within them, and the Grimke sisters are going to show that there are, in fact, Southerners that oppose slavery too. Not everyone in the South is a rich, wealthy plantation owner. The Grimke sisters came from a family that was not a part of that rich plantation system. They opposed that. They opposed slavery. They did not like it. And so it proves not only to Northerners, but other Southerners that are like-minded, that is not the majority mindset in the South. At least there's a very small minority that agrees, yes, in the South, yes, slavery exists, and it may be our way of life, but it's a terrible way of life. It's a terrible way of doing things, and that does need to change. So the Underground Railroad, you just have the networks here showing where it is that these runaway slaves are going to. You see a significant portion of them are going to the north and in fact are fleeing into Canada, because after the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, they realize the north is not a safe place to be. This is not where it is that we need to remain. We need to go to Canada, where we can get away from this, where federal jurisdiction no longer rules, where the United States cannot get us. But anyway, what the Underground Railroad is, hopefully you don't think it is an actual railroad, because it's not. What it is, it's a network of houses, and it's a network of people that assist slaves in seeking their freedom, in getting to the north, or in some cases getting further south, getting into Mexico, where slavery is outlawed, or getting to the Caribbean islands down here, where slavery is also outlawed. Harriet Tubman being one of the more significant figures within the Underground Railroad movement. I'm sure you've heard her name before in association with that, but she ends up leading about 300 slaves to freedom. Being an ex-slave herself, she escaped to the north, and then found it her purpose in life to assist others to escape as well. Since she had done it successfully, she wanted to contribute and wanted to help these individuals. Some of the symbols that they would use in order for slaves to understand what it is that they needed to do to avoid capture: the monkey wrench pattern told slaves to prepare to flee, or the drunkard path design warned escapees not to follow a straight route. Just different symbols within the abolitionist movement, within the Underground Railroad, that told slaves how it is they could best escape from the South. But more significant than maybe the Underground Railroad and maybe all of this is Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852. There's a myth, it's not true, but there's a myth that Lincoln actually met with this young woman. Not particularly young in this picture, but anyway, that Lincoln met with her, and upon meeting her, he said to her, "Oh, so you're this little woman that started this great big war," essentially saying that Uncle Tom's Cabin, this novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, caused the Civil War. But what was Uncle Tom's Cabin? What did it do? So it depicted slavery as a moral evil and inspired many in the North to join the abolitionist cause. Northerners knew slavery existed. You would have to have been living under a rock not to think it did. It was the hot-button issue of this time period. But a lot of Northerners didn't know what slavery was actually like. And what Uncle Tom's Cabin did is it gave people a personal insight into really the worst-case scenario of slavery. Uncle Tom is a slave who lives on a plantation of a very abusive slave owner. And it really enlightens Northerners who were kind of on the fence as to whether to join the abolitionist cause or not. It leads them to realize this is awful, this is terrible, and we really need to support this cause. We really need to support helping these people leave. And it actually becomes the best-selling book of the 19th century, passed only by the Bible, which seems to be the best-selling book no matter when it is that you're talking about. So, Compromise is necessary once again. Well, not compromise, just governmental action in this case. It's not a compromise. So in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, written, drafted by Stephen Douglas primarily. So what the Kansas-Nebraska Act does, dealing with the Kansas territory here, and the Nebraska territory, is it does essentially the same thing the Compromise of 1850 did with the Utah territory and the New Mexico territory. Instead of going along with the Missouri Compromise and using this compromise line, this 3630 line, instead of doing that, they go, well, here's what we'll do. Popular sovereignty seemed to work pretty well out here, so we'll allow popular sovereignty in the Kansas territory and the Nebraska territory as well. Let the people decide whether they want slavery there or whether they want those territories to be free. So to do this, they have to repeal the Missouri Compromise. So after the Kansas and Nebraska Act, the Missouri Compromise is gone. So 1854, Kansas-Nebraska Act cancels out the Missouri Compromise. Northerners were very upset by this, though. Northerners did not like the Kansas-Nebraska Act because it allows slavery to spread in areas where previously they didn't think slavery would be a threat. Kansas and Nebraska they thought was off limits, but now it's back on the table. Slavery could exist there. So as a result, a lot of Northerners, and we'll actually do a chart dealing with a lot of these political parties in class, a lot of these Northerners that were part of the Free Soil Party or the Anti-Slavery Party or the Conscience Whig Party, they'll all join together and form the Republican Party in 1854. But popular sovereignty actually isn't as good of a solution as the government thought it was going to be. It doesn't solve those problems because when a vote arrives in Kansas in 1855 to decide on whether or not Kansas would be a slave or a free state, a lot of people illegally migrate into this territory from Missouri and they illegally vote. There are posters placed all throughout Missouri by both sides. Anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces place posters within Missouri and tell people the date and the time, when to show up, when this vote is, and to come into Kansas and vote in a territory that would eventually become a state in which they weren't residents. Trump talks about illegal voting and voter fraud. Well, this is a great case of that, a great example of that. This is voter fraud, people voting in a territory where they did not live. You have pro-slavery Missourians sneaking across the border to vote. You also have pro-slavery Missourians that are voting in Kansas. So it's not, once the final word comes out, it's not actually a representation of what the people that live in that territory want. But this illegal vote eventually gave Kansas slavery when its residents voted against it. Most of the people that lived within the Kansas territory did not want slavery. However, so many pro-slavery forces migrate into this territory that slavery becomes a thing. Slavery is going to be admitted into the Kansas territory and what would eventually become the state of Kansas. And because of this, because you have these two groups, the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery forces, all within this small territory, in this powder keg of Kansas, it's going to lead to an armed conflict. This is like a little tiny civil war that occurs just within Kansas. That will eventually be known as Bleeding Kansas. It's a war that breaks out between the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery forces because they've been illegally migrating into this territory and illegally voting. So once again here, just a breakdown. From 1850 to 1856, sectionalism in America increased due to, first off, the growth of abolitionism, which has been contributed to thanks to negative response and negative ideas of what the Fugitive Slave Act means for Northerners that have to send fugitive slaves back to the South and sometimes free blacks that get captured. Also, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which enlightens Northerners to what it is slavery is like within the South. And also the Kansas-Nebraska Act. An instance where democracy fails, an instance where the people are actually not heard because you have these pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces sending people that don't live in the Kansas territory to vote. Also, you have the birth of regional, not national political parties. So political parties are no longer centered around just specifically ideals. They're now centered around regions. Northerners are going to be majority Republican. Southerners are going to be majority Democrat, and that's the way that it is just going to be within the United States. If you're a Northerner, that's how you vote. If you're a Southerner, that's how you vote. And these sectional tensions finally are becoming so bad, so heated between these two groups that compromise just is no longer going to be an option. And eventually all of this is going to boil over into what becomes the Civil War. And that's that, y'all.